an M1 lookalike built on an old Soviet chassis. The other day, North Korea released a video showing Kim Jong-un standing on top of a new tank. At first glance, it looked pretty impressive. Desert camouflage, composite armor, an active protection system, and anti-tank missiles hanging off the turret. It's like a mini version of the US M1 tank, with a touch of Russia's T-14 flavor. The West gave it the code name M2020, while North Korea calls it the Cholima 2. But here's the kicker. It hasn't even been mass-produced. When you count them up, there are only about 10 of these tanks in the world. They look intimidating, but the numbers are small. Now the real question that keeps you up at night is, how did they even make it? North Korea has been under UN sanctions for over 20 years. The country could they make a tank that looks so close to the M1, with thermal imaging, fire control systems, and an active protection system? The answer is pretty clear. China's helping behind the scenes. While it may not be true that China gave North Korea a ready-made M1, the old production lines, heavy chassis, aluminum, machined electronic components could come from China. These were considered excess capacity in China, but for North Korea, they're just enough to piece together a Cholima 2. And these two countries are neighbors, right? Today, it's a shipment of machine tools. Tomorrow, it's some aluminum, all under civilian labels and sent over every so often. Eventually, you end up with a whole production line. UN reports can hardly track every single item. A batch of Hwasong-15 intercontinental missile launchers were believed to be just modified versions of China's WS-51200 logging truck chassis. The supply chain truth, China's invisible production line. The Cholima 2 tank isn't directly made in China, but without China's resources, North Korea would struggle to produce such an imitation under UN sanctions. Let's take a look at the numbers. In 2013, trade between North Korea and China peaked at over $7 billion, marking the height of Kim Jong-un's external economic relations. After sanctions tightened and the pandemic hit, North Korea's foreign trade was nearly reduced to just China. By 2022, over 96% of North Korea's foreign trade was with China. And in 2023, trade between the two countries recovered to $2.32 billion, nearly 83% of the pre-pandemic level in 2019. When North Korea set out to create a new generation main battle tank, it could get everything it needed from China and Russia, such as high-strength steel, aluminum alloys, CNC machine tools, vehicle electronics, and rubber tires. Further supplies could potentially come from countries like Iran, but when it comes to heavy industry and electromechanics, only China offers a complete supply chain. This is the core reason why the Cholima 2 is so closely tied to China's influence. A report by 38 North and the UN 1718 Commission includes a typical investigation on China's heavy-duty off-road truck, the WS-51200. In 2011, North Korea's Ministry of Forestry imported 6 of these off-road trucks from Wuhan Sanjiang Import and Export Company, declaring them as heavy-duty forestry transport vehicles. These trucks, large, all-terrain, and 8-axle, could be used for transporting heavy equipment like transformers under civilian guise. A few years later, satellite images and North Korean propaganda videos showed these trucks were modified with hydraulic legs and rails to become the launchers for the Hwasong-14 and 15 intercontinental missile transporters. The UN group's conclusion was clear. North Korea didn't have the ability to manufacture the heavy-duty TEL chassis like the WS-51200. That chassis was made in China, with North Korea only modifying the launch structure and the missile itself. Applying this logic to the Cholima 2, it's easy to imagine a similar supply chain. The chassis is likely based on North Korea's own extended T-62 derivatives, but the engine, transmission, hydraulic systems, and even some components may well have come from China's heavy truck and construction machinery supply chains. China is the only place where North Korea can reliably source diesel engines, heavy-duty transmissions, and axle components. Looking deeper, it's important to focus on the components and machine tools. Multiple reports by the UN Security Council's 1718 Committee have highlighted this issue. North Korea continues to attempt to acquire key equipment like CNC machines and mill turn centers from China and other countries. These machines are nominally for general machining, but they're essential for manufacturing high-precision military components like missile casings, gun barrels, and bearings. In the 2010s, North Korea was frequently caught sourcing CNC machines, bearings, and processing centers through third-party countries. When the Cholima 2 tank made its debut in 2020, it already featured a muzzle reference system on the gun barrel. meaning the machining precision and thermal deformation control were no longer just about being functional, but about achieving accurate compensation after continuous firing. To achieve this, a whole set of CNC equipment and measuring tools is required, and much of this, as shown in public cases, has come from Chinese companies. Next, let's look at materials. Since 2014, the UN expert group has repeatedly mentioned North Korea's efforts to obtain high-strength aluminum alloys and special steels, many of which have been sourced through Chinese trade channels. The reports directly listed product codes, all for high-strength aluminum profiles, tubes, and sheets. These materials are typically used for missile casings, aircraft parts, armor components, and radar antenna structures. Now let's look at the Cholima-2 turret. Large modular armor boxes, APS launchers, radar units, and thicker ERA modules and side skirts on newer versions. The entire boxed and framework design consumes large amounts of high-strength steel, aluminum, and bonding materials. In North Korea's limited steel production and power-scarce environment, achieving the armor thickness that looks like nearly a third or fourth generation design would be impossible without external material supplements. Finally, there's the electrical and optical electronic systems. On the Cholima-2 turret, you'll find a gunner's independent thermal imager, a gunner's thermal sight, night vision cameras, radar and detectors for active protection, and electro-optical systems for the remote weapon station. While these boxes can be assembled in North Korea, the infrared detectors, CCD and CMOS modules, DSP chips, and power semiconductors are components that North Korea cannot manufacture domestically. At this point, China's role becomes clear. It is the largest legitimate supplier of raw components, exporting them under the guise of civilian security and automotive electronics, while third countries serve as transshipment platforms. Small batches of chips and modules are passed through trade companies multiple times before eventually reaching North Korea's military factories in Pyongyang. So, when you see the high-tech cameras on the Cholima-2 turret, you can picture the supply chain. Security factories in Shenzhen and Suzhou, to Southeast Asian transshipment, to Dandong port, and then to Pyongyang's military factories, and finally, to Kim Jong-un waving from the turret. This is the real Chinese influence on the Cholima-2, not drawing the blueprints for you, but providing the parts supermarket that make up a modern tank. From the available evidence, it's hard to say that China directly participated in the design and assembly of the whole vehicle. No authoritative report has ever said that Chinese tank engineers are guiding North Korean workshops. It's more that China sold off civilian off-road chassis, and North Korea modified them into launchers in its own factory. The Cholima-2 shows a mix of elements from different countries. The turret looks like an M1 T-14. The chassis is stretched like Iran's Zulfikar 3, and the APS layout is very Russian. The general assumption is that Russia, China, and Iran helped at different stages. A more realistic way to describe this is that Beijing has built North Korea a semi-closed military windbreak. The shelter has 3 layers. 1. Over 90% of North Korea's foreign trade is tied to China. Whether it's exchanging coal and oil exports for foreign currency or small border trade cash flows, it gives North Korea a bit of financial room to develop high-tech equipment. 2. Heavy chassis, construction machinery, power generation equipment, machine tools, aluminum, electronic components. The vast majority can be found in China. With just a few shell companies, sanctions can be avoided. 3. When UN sanctions are enforced, much of it depends on member states policing themselves. When your biggest trading partner turns a blind eye to border smuggling and third country transshipments, North Korea essentially has an umbrella from the sanction. So the Cholima-2 isn't just a Chinese tank copy. It's a grotesque result of China's industrial system, Russia's military remnants, and Iran's Middle Eastern battlefield experience, manifest in a country that prioritizes military needs in a state of extreme deprivation. You see Kim Jong-un waving from the turret, but behind the scenes are China's machine tool factories, truck factories, security firms, along with the experienced hands of Russia and Iran. And because of this, its significance goes beyond just being a new tank. It raises a bigger question. With this supply chain backing it, to what level can North Korea elevate its position on the battlefield? Has it truly gained some real military strength, or is it just a well-polished parade filter? To answer that, we'll have to see it on the battlefield. Battlefield performance, from overwhelming victory to localized time gaps. To sum up the technical evaluation in one sentence, the Cholima-2 has the appearance of a third-generation half-tank, but its actual hardware level is more like a 2.5 to third generation. It looks like an M1 or T-14 with a composite armor, ERA, APS, thermal imaging, and external missiles, but the chassis still relies on the old Soviet T-62, T-72 design, and there's no evidence that its fire control or ammunition system systems are on par with tanks like the M1A2, SEP V3, or K2. It can fight, but it doesn't live up to its looks. Before the Cholima 2 emerged, the tank comparison on the Korean peninsula was as follows. South Korea had 1,500 K1, K1A1, and K1A2 tanks, with an ongoing production line for the K2 Black Panther. The North primarily had T-55 and T-62s, along with modified tanks like the Cholima and Storm Tiger. In terms of fire control, night vision, ammunition, and air support, the North's tanks were at least a generation and a half behind. Under this setup, the North Korean military wasn't exaggerating when they described future tank combat as one-sided slaughter. On the same terrain, with the same level of training, once northern tanks exposed themselves, they would be wiped out by a technological gap spanning multiple generations. What the Cholima 2 changes is this. If North Korea concentrates its current fleet of a dozen or so, and possibly dozens more in the future, and then utilizes advantageous terrains like night combat, valleys, and harsh weather conditions, South Korean tanks would have to take a different approach. The North has a fleet with paper specs close to third-generation plus tanks, thermal imaging, missiles, and APS. Second, the South Korean military must now adjust its combat plans to account for this change. Reconnaissance forces must be denser, artillery and air support must be sufficiently mobile, and they can no longer assume that as soon as they spot northern tanks, they can destroy them in one round. In simpler terms, the Cholima 2 has raised the cost of preparation for the South Korean military. The problem is, the next war on the Korean peninsula is unlikely to be like the 1973 tank versus tank face-off, and more likely to resemble an upgraded version of the Russia-Ukraine battlefield. Front lines will be littered with anti-tank mines, remote explosives, and guided shells. Above, there will be layer upon layer of reconnaissance drones, FPV suicide drones, and loitering munition. Behind, there will be long-range rocket artillery and tactical ballistic missiles, always ready to target tank clusters with a god's eye view. In this environment, the Cholima 2 has to pass through three major hurdles. First hurdle, external missiles. The Bullseye 3 missile itself is fine, but the problem lies in how it's mounted. The launch box is mounted high on the turret's right side, with no armor shielding it. The internal missile bay isn't visible, which means every time the missile is fired, the crew has to manually load a new one into the turret's side. From the perspective of FPV drones, this is a big, hard, explosive target. Approaching from an angled position, it's easy to hit and detonate the missile, causing even more damage. So while these missiles might look impressive in parade footage, in real combat they could actually become a lightning rod. The Chonma 2's APS seems to be a low-budget imitation of the Afghanet system. The launch units are embedded in the turret's front and sides, following a similar layout. North Korea propaganda videos have also shown demonstrations of the system intercepting incoming rocket fire. But who's it really going to stop? It's not just a few slow RPGs, but a whole wave of FPVs, suicide drones, loitering munitions, and even APF SDS rounds coming from different directions. To achieve this, the following is needed: millimeter wave radar, infrared or electro-optical multi-sensor systems, a calculation platform that can complete detection, identification, calculation, and interception within 0.1 to 0.2 seconds, precise coverage angles and redundancy in design. Given North Korea's current microelectronics and real-time clock technology, achieving the level of the Afghanet or trophy system is nearly impossible. What's more, from the photos, the spacing between the AFP models on the Cholima 2 isn't small, and there's a noticeable gap at the top. It's hard to expect it to last long under multi-directional and multi-wave attacks. The US M1A2, SEP V3, and South Korea's K2 tanks are designed as network nodes. The tanks have a battlefield management system, with a large screen displaying friendly forces, enemy positions, and mission markings. They share a data link with drones, artillery, and infantry, allowing target information to be transmitted in seconds. What about the Chonma 2? From available footage, we can confirm that it has thermal imaging, MRS, and small antennas. But there's no sign of a mature battlefield situation display terminal, nor is there any clear evidence that it's connected to a brigade-level C4I system. The reality is likely that it's a tank with high-definition eyes, but a very limited information outlet. What it sees needs to be transmitted through radio or verbally, while the opponent's drones have already sent its coordinates, orientation, and cover status into the entire firepower network. This is the fundamental difference between a network mode and an information island. Putting these factors together, what the Chonma 2 can actually bring to North Korea in the next high-intensity war is something very limited: a local time gap and a psychological buffer in the first 24 to 48 hours after the battle starts. But once the battle reaches a truly high-intensity phase, the survival rate of the Chonma-2 will still depend on North Korea's three weakest areas: air defense, electronic warfare, and logistics. For these, a single tank can do nothing, and in fact, will only expose the problems more clearly. The Chonma-2 closely resembles the US's M1, but what it truly represents is a question: how a country under sanctions for 20 years, with China's supply chain and remnants of Russia and Iranian technology, has still managed to take a leap forward in developing next-generation warfare tools. For South Korea and the US, this tank is far from being a game-changing superweapon, but it serves as a reminder: if we only focus on that small piece of steel on the peninsula and ignore a multinational supply chain behind it, the next thing that appears in a parade might not be an M1 imitation, but an entire imitation of a composite warfare system. That is the part of the Chonma-2 that should not be underestimated.